So that's it for the intro. Now it's time to dig into our panel discussion. So I'd like to invite onto the stage our four panelists. We've got Aaron VonderHaar, we've got Ian Mackenzie, we've got Matt Griffith, and we've got Harry Sarson. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. So I'm really excited to have this group here to talk about open source in Elm. And so to kick it off, why don't we just start kind of going around the round table here, and why doesn't everybody just give a brief introduction, tell us about sort of the open source work that you're passionate about or focused on right now, and maybe like share briefly how did you first get involved in open source, and what if you remember your first open source contribution, what sparked that? What project was it? So just anybody who wants to start, let's go around to the four panelists.
You should probably call on us.
Aaron.
It'll go smoother.
Thanks for volunteering.
Great. All right, open source. So yeah, my earliest contribution, I actually looked this up on one of my Twitch streams a few weeks ago, was for Step Mania, which is a clone of Dance Dance Revolution. And you can find the email thread. That was back when you still submitted pull requests by emailing a patch to the maintainer on the email list. So you can still find that email list. Apparently I was fixing some Linux driver bug for something to make the sound play on my system. But yeah, I got into open source mainly from like installing Linux over and over on old computers that I got from my grandparents when I was in high school. So currently people probably know me as the author and maintainer of Elm format, which is written in Haskell, but well known in the Elm community. So that is definitely my most stars earned for open source. But I've, filled in gaps where I've needed other Elm libraries to exist as well. Elm Program Test is a package that I've used a lot at work.
Love it.
And what else? I've helped a bit with Elm Test itself and fixing bugs and helping upgrade that to Elm 19. I did the Elm upgrade script that would help you automatically upgrade your dependencies and code to Elm 19, and a bunch of random little other packages that I've needed from time to time.
Thanks for all those contributions. I've definitely used all of them heavily. Yeah. Awesome. Great. Thanks, Aaron. Harry, I see your video next on the screen. Would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. I had a look at my first contribution. There's a JavaScript library called math.js, and I submitted an implementation of the QR decomposition to math.js. So if you're ever using JavaScript and you want a bad QR implementation, I can recommend one for you. But yeah, if you want a repository to make your first open source contributions to, I can actually highly recommend math.js. The maintainer, Josh de Jong, is super friendly. And he really taught me through, got me help my feet in the open source world. So if you want a friendly getting started place, I can't recommend that highly enough.
Wonderful. And what are you focused on or excited about now?
Yeah, at the moment, I've taken over in a sort of informal way from Richard, the Node test runner repository, so the Elm test package on NPM, which is cool because a lot of people use that, it seems, and it wasn't getting much love for a while. So we've managed to get a bit more momentum now, and a lot of people have started submitting patches again, which is cool. I think people realizing that get some attention now if they submit them, which wasn't always the case. So I think the next year or so, we're going to see a real big increase in quality of a test runner, because it's a really useful package and it does great things. But it's still rough around the edges. So it'd be great to add a bit of polish there.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm very, very excited to hear that. Excellent. Ian, would you like to go next? Oh, I believe you're muted, Ian, or at least I can't hear you. There we. We may be having technical difficulties. Can anyone else hear Ian, or is it just me? No. Sorry about that, Ian. Maybe you want to try like closing and rejoining or something. I'm not sure what might be going on there.
Any better? Is that?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you loud and clear. Excellent.
I tried a different voice setting, and I guess it backfired. I'm Ian Mackenzie. Sorry about that. And I guess it's sort of in very broad terms, I'm trying to work towards sort of turning Elm into a really awesome ecosystem for doing sort of geometry and graphics and engineering, and ultimately things like making, right? 3D printing and making cool physical stuff. And so to that end, I've been working on packages. Author of Elm units, or working typed quantities, length, and angle, and mass, and like that. Elm geometry, which is a pretty generic geometry package, points and vectors, and transformation, measurement. And then most recently, Elm 3D scene for doing 3D graphic. But lots more stuff planned. I'm sort of really excited about getting into, generating shapes and then 3D printing them and sort of moving Elm into the real world.
Yes. Love it.
Trying to think back to sort of like first open source sort of engagement or contribution. Actually, if you look back far enough in Elm, I used to use the OpenSolid name for some of my packages, which I've sort of since retired in favor of the literal Elm names philosophy. But I used to use that name a lot. And I think at some point I found there was some guy on SourceForge who was also using the name OpenSolid for something. And so I sort of emailed him and said, hey, I've got this name. I'm not really using it that much. Do you want me to give it to you on GitHub so you can have the same name everywhere? And then it turned out we were actually kind of working on similar but complementary things. And so we sort of said, well, why don't we just sort of combine efforts and, merge our code bases and turn the two OpenSolids into one OpenSolid. At the time he was working on sort of, like high-level interactivity stuff, and I was working on sort of low-level math she hadn't done much on. So we had a good collaboration for a while, but he sort of drifted off. He didn't have a lot of time. I drifted away from C++. But I think that was my sort of first sort of interesting introductions, working with others, and collaborating, and so that was fun. But yeah.
Fantastic.
I can't think my first patch. I have to look up.
Do you have any idea what language it might have been in?
Well, I mean, probably C++, because that sort of that was my language for quite a while. I can't remember if I contributed. Well, I think way back in the day I looked at contributing to try to. I was using Linux and I had some weird Microsoft phone and I wanted to have it sync with my KDE calendar, and so I looked into supporting the project that was developing adapters, sync different phones, KDE. I think it turned out that was giving me more work than I was hoping for. Yeah, a few little things like that.
Cool, great.
I made some documentation improvements in Scala. Try to work on the doc tool there. I have to look it up.
Interesting. Yeah, great. Thanks, Ian. All right, Matt, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Hello, I'm Matt Griffith. Let's see. So I'm probably known best for Elm UI in the Elm world, but I also have done a number of other packages, including two animation approaches, Elm Style Animation and Elm Animator, and also my own markup language called Elm Markup, which the idea there is actually, I realized actually recently that I misnamed it, because it's like the thing that's focusing on is that there's this sort of markup language that's kind of like Markdown-ish, but you can kind of extend it however you want in a lot of ways. But it's really sort of about implementing the brain of a text editor in sort of a way where you can send updates to an AST and stuff. But yeah, so let's see. First, like actual open source contribution. It's interesting because I don't think I've actually made a whole heck of a lot of them. Like I think I started. This is a little bit pre-Elm, but I wrote some stuff for Atom, the editor. I forget exactly what it was. I think it was actually this was a while ago. So this is before. Like I wanted to add little like hover messages like above like an error, right? So it's like you'd actually see like a little message bubble, and they didn't have that, right? And so I remember implementing that. Though I'm not even sure if that was actually like a contribution or if it was more just like a separate package. And then kind of more recently, or like after that, was getting into the Elm community. This is before I had written any sort of Elm code. And I remember specifically like adding a function to like list extra. Okay. Right. I forget exactly what I was doing, but I was like, I remember that interaction. And now like looking, I'm pretty sure like that function is like not necessary. It's pretty easy to kind of put together with other stuff, but I definitely remember doing it.
Yeah.
So
awesome. Yeah, the journey is really fascinating. How we change our trajectory of open source over time. I remember a lot of open source projects I had lying around that weren't really meaningful to people early on except myself, but that got me in the mindset of learning to build things that were meaningful to others. So great. Let's dive in a little more here. So I'm curious to hear from anybody who sort of gets a light bulb to this question. How do you think about the process of getting input from users? Because I think this is a very personal thing. Different open source projects and different maintainers, and this may differ over time. Have completely different approaches to this. So how do you get input? What have been some interactions that maybe have surprised you, or where you've gotten something from the community that you don't think you would have been able to build without that feedback loop from the community?
Yeah, I mean, the first one that comes to mind for me is just like questions on the Elm Slack.
Nice.
And I think I'm not sure people realize how useful that can be to maintainers. And I've often had people like, ask a question and talk about something they're doing and sort of, profusely apologize for wasting my time talking through this. And it's like, no, this is really useful, right? Like, how else would I know what people are doing with this package and where they're running into to issues? So I really, I love hearing back from people, and then patterns emerge over time, right? You get the same kind of question a couple times. You're like, okay, well, there at least need to be some better docs here, or maybe an improved BI. So definitely, encourage people to reach out on the Elm Slack. Any questions, but also just if you've done something cool, it's awesome, and like it's really rewarding as a maintainer, but also really useful. Like, oh, people tend to use this a lot for this application. I should think a bit more about how can I make it better or more featureful or smoother for that kind of thing. So I think that's certainly that's the first big one.
Yeah.
Just to jump that like line of information just sort of, I mean, it can be kind of stressful actually to be in the Elm UI Slack, because like my brain goes into problem solving mode. I want to fix everybody's problems, right? But just hearing, like, again, you have these data points and you see kind of some subtle things happen, like kind of Ian mentioned, like these patterns over time, right? So you may see like, okay, well, maybe like this issue sort of comes up and it's a very subtle issue, but like it comes up a lot and it's solved pretty quickly. And people might say like, okay, they might look at the design of whatever feature they're trying to do. Like one is that's kind of a pain in Elm UI is actually getting scroll bars to work correctly. And and it's sort of interesting to see these, like all these data points sort of come in, because it gives clarity not only on kind of what is the problem, but also that something could be better. Because sometimes it's like they'll come and they'll get the solution. They'll be like, okay, like I should have known better, or I like the fault was on me, the user, or whatever. And like me, the designer, I'm seeing that and I'm like, oh, but like 10 people have come up and said this like subtle little distinction just was not communicated like well, so I'm like, there probably is some sort of better design there. Like, and then I have to sort of sit with it because it may not be obvious what that actual design nuance is, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. So what kind of in your experience, just everybody on the panel here, what have been helpful ways to get contributions? Because I know that this is something that's talked about in the Elm community a lot. I know Evan gave a talk once where he talked about code is not the only way to contribute. A conversation is a contribution, and a bug report and a whatever that combination of letters is, SSCCEE, a simple minimal reproduction of a problem is a contribution, right? So in all of your experience, what are some of the things that stand out to you in your mind? And maybe if you can remember a particular experience that you felt there was a contribution in any form that you were like, wow, this was great, this was really useful.
Yeah, well, I can say that, like, for me, especially with Elm format and for a lot of other stuff in Elm, I'd say that encouraging contributions is an area that me personally, and I think a lot of people, haven't really had a lot of time to develop or invest in. It's like Elm's still relatively new. Yeah. It's also kind of the type of language where people start using it and they want to do things fast because that's kind of what it's built for. So like some of the conversations you're referring to and some of the discourse conversations, I think highlighted that to me. So actually, maybe that's a good place for contributions to the contributing instructions for different repositories, at least for maintainers that are open to that. Because something that I've noticed is like explaining to people more about kind of the philosophy of the project is very important to getting contributions that are actually like going to be acceptable and are like in line with the future goals of the project and can make it clear to someone whether or not a particular idea or contribution is going to have a path towards getting merged versus if it's not. And I think that in particular is an area that Elm format is pretty short on. And just another side thing related to some non-Elm open source projects I maintained for a while. As a maintainer personally, I've tried to like keep an eye out for people who are either asking questions or starting to make contributions, or maybe are active on the Slack or whatever. Yeah. And people who seem to like have an interest in wanting to contribute more, but maybe don't know what questions to ask, and just like reach out to them, have a personal conversation and interaction and see where that goes to. Actually, I used to maintain this open source Mac app for tracking timesheets. And I eventually transferred it over to this other guy who was in college and was really excited to like have this project to own, and I didn't want to maintain it anymore. And all that came just from like getting to know a bit about this person who just was like asking questions about the app in the beginning and was like, oh, why doesn't this work on the new version of Mac OS?
Right. That's a lovely point. It really is about people, isn't it? Because open source is community and community is people. And yeah, building those connections is powerful. Love that. Harry, did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that my favorite contributions are always tooling contributions. Like if you
Ah,
make a pull request that adds a test, or make a pull request that adds linting, I
nice,
love those. I
nice.
love to see them. They're easy to review. They
Yeah.
make other people's contributions easier as well. So it's a positive feedback loop there.
Wonderful point. I've gotten some contributions out of nowhere from you on that, Harry. That you just like fixed some tooling stuff. I'm like, wow, that's great. Love it. Yeah.
They're also the best ones to make because they get accepted.
Right. Right. And you know they're going to be have an impact.
Yeah.
So on that note, what are some things that have helped reduce the barrier to entry? For contributions, whether it's for for someone else to contribute or for your own contributions. Like, how do you manage a project so that you streamline and allow contributions to happen and allow the project to evolve and grow?
I mean, I think it's like communication, right?
Mm.
So the contributions that I've it's been interesting because right we think about contribution again as like someone sort of without contact creates some code, puts up this perfect PR, the the maintainer looks at it and be like, oh, this is great, you have a typo here, but please, or I will accept this, whatever. It's like we sort of think of that, but the things that I sort of see as valuable, there's a few different interactions, right? And we've sort of mentioned a few of these, but it's like really concise, small examples that show an issue. Those are gold. Tooling, like Harry mentioned, is awesome. I've actually with Elm UI, like trying to get the test suite runnable by everybody was sort of something I was trying to do a little bit ago. It's still a little wonky, but like that enables just so much. Right. And then there's sort of other interactions. Again, the question is sort of what am I doing to, or what can be done to like facilitate contributions. Some of the more interesting ones recently have been, so I released Elm Animator, right, which is this kind of fun way to do animations, and got some interest from a few people who are very kind of prolific, or like, they jump into projects. So there was Andre Kuzman on Soundscapes, who does the WebGL stuff and a lot Elm physics and a lot of other really cool stuff. And I was able to speak with him right after release. And so basically the release was sort of like a little bit of a little bit of energy kind of injected, where we could actually sit down and be like, okay, I'm like, the tool is out there, it works. Now I can actually like speak with him, because he was like, I'm making this like little cool game that I want to make, and I want to use your library. And basically just working through him on his project, right? So he's like, I'm trying to do this, but this is the literal problem I'm running into. And the thing in my brain that was happening was like, I'm like, I thought this was like a small piece of like that area you're in. I thought that was going to be a place that like someone would only, rarely go. But I can see now, just seeing how you're doing things, that people are going to go immediately here if they're in this area. Like, or if they're making a game or something, they're going to want this feature. So like iterating with him after having a project out, iterating with him was actually an incredibly valuable form of contribution, or I guess collaboration, right? He wasn't writing any code. He was writing his game.
Yeah.
But like he was like, I'm trying to solve, this is the problem I'm running into, and I don't know how to do it. And so it's like sometimes you get these opportunities to go deeper with individual people, and that's so incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
So it's sort of interesting. It's like, what can you do to facilitate contributions? Yeah, I mean, tooling it's tough. It's hard, right? Because like another thing I run into with Elm UI was, I run into this specifically with Elm UI, but other projects sort of have this too, of just like bug fixes are actually really hard to evaluate, because it's like modifying underlying CSS. And I'm like, I see your PR, it changes one line of code, but it could break everything, and I'm like, I don't have time to like really run this through the gamut, even though like this is checking out in my brain. I'm pretty sure this is okay.
Which
it's
is
just
why
hard.
having a simple minimal reproduction is something that strictly reduces the workload of the maintainer.
Yeah, because if I
never
like
increases. But if you
So-
make a small PR and it's a one-line CSS change, that could be hours of your time thinking about that. Is that the right direction?
Right.
What implications does that have?
So totally. So an example being like people will submit these little tiny little examples, which the more concise and the more directed they are, is awesome. It's like if you have like any extra stuff, it's just like it all has to go, because what's going to happen is I'm going to have a folder that's going to be like the scroll, like tests/scroll bars, and I'm going to have, and it might even be like manual tests/scroll bars, because it's sort of hard to test like CSS like without just doing a visual check on a bunch of browsers. And like if I make something that I know affects scroll bars, I'm going to actually be going through all these. I'm not going to revisit it just that one time when we fix that one issue. Like I have to sort of go through all these examples and see like, okay, these are all sort of the weird edge cases for scroll bars.
Yeah.
Like, and for all submitted by other people, or maybe I, made one up. And I have to reevaluate it. Right.
Right.
So,
And I
yeah, it's like part of the knowledge base.
go ahead, Aaron.
Love to
Which I think, like in Elm format, that's something that has allowed me to to accept some smaller bug fixes on a few instances. I mean, I haven't had a lot because a lot of people are afraid to jump into Haskell code. But kind of from the beginning of Elm format, I was like writing a test suite for everything I did, and like every new parser feature, new formatting thing, I would put in the test suite, like basically every edge case I could think of, and I wasn't done and moving on until I'd gotten that tested. And it's like there's the test suite for Elm format has, okay, here's what a like Boolean expression looks like. And then here's the version where you have comments in where there's every white space. And here's the version where you have like the other kind of comment at every white space. And having that has like really given me confidence in those types of bugs. I know, like in the case of Elm UI, it's a totally different beast where you're working with browsers and trying to test it. So
it's kind of, there's a similarity there, because it's like you're taking sort of the large inputs, like the area of input space is huge and the area of output space is huge, right?
Yeah.
So
Nice.
Which actually, that was a shortcut I took too in Elm format. I took a couple open source projects and just cloned their repo in, and that was a test suite for Elm format. And there's a couple still in there, but
that's nice. Yeah, I have, so for Elm UI, the sort of the automatic test, super awesome, but also kind of a pain, is where it actually will boot up a browser, render like a layout, and then sort of gather bounding boxes and then do some math to check it. So it's kind of cool, because it's like, oh, if something says that it's in the center, it's able to sort of check itself. And that's like a really cool approach. The challenge there, though, is like sometimes you'll get these errors, and like if you you generate a bunch of layouts, it can be really hard to track down, like, okay, but what is actually broken? Because I have 1,000 tests, like 26 of them are failing. It's not super obvious that they're all like one like thing, right? So large inputs, large outputs, or large space on both sides can be just it's a hard problem,
Right.
Yeah. So I guess advice for contributors is like, if you want to contribute, first thing you do when you check out the repository, run the test suite. Hopefully I try to do that at the bottom of my README, is say, here's how you run the tests. Then you run it, make a failing test, do your thing. Because that, at least for me, really makes it easier to accept contributions.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Ian.
Yeah.
No, it's like, I guess a couple of points. I mean, certainly, like, talking about, Matt working with Andre, I've had sort of similar experiences. Is like, even if people not necessarily have had problems, but they've written something and they said, hey, I did this, and here's what I wrote, and like it kind of feels awkward maybe, or even not. Like sometimes they just show me code for some random reason, but I'll look at it and say, oh, interesting. That's not how I would have written that, but I can see how you would have gotten there, and that's also a really interesting way to sort of better docs, like it's not clear what this function does, or it's not clear that really you should use this other function instead in this situation. So that's been really useful. And definitely agree that, you know, there are lots of issues on my repositories where, you know, like, I'm not even sure exactly how to address them. And so I feel very nervous about trying to like work through one of them with a new contributor. But I think one of the most effective strategies I've found is, you know, if you're working through something, think, oh, here's a cool little thing I could add. And it's just like some fun, self-contained little thing that I can just go right away and implement it. Maybe don't, because those are sort of the things that are really easy for somebody else to contribute. And so now I try to get in the habit of, hey, here's a nice little bit of functionality. I'm just going to write up an issue for it. And knowing that, you know, at some point, there's a good chance that will be a fun way for someone to jump in. I guess like for me, that's also like my hands hurt if I type too much. And so there's a bit of, well, if someone else wants to do that, that's great. My hands don't have to. But that's been really good. And then, you know, you work through a few of those issues with somebody, and you get to know them, and you're like, okay, you know, like this person seems to have good judgment, and we can get along well. I've got a good rapport, and then you can move into actually collaborating on really tricky issues. Saying, well, how do you think we should address it? But I think sort of consciously trying to leave some self-contained, fun, well-defined issues, and not resist the urge to sort of just tackle them.
Right. Yeah, great point.
There's another form of contribution that I sort of realized that probably maybe directly addressed, but like as a maintainer, designer, whatever I'm doing, I'm very grateful for how much patience people have for me. Like when I'm you know, oh, the thing I'm currently working on is I'm actually working on this other project that's not the project we're talking about right now. Like, and so just a little bit of the vast majority of the times this happens, right? People are very aware, and it's just very appreciated on this side. It's like another contribution can be like, you know, I do all this outside of work, you know, and so keeping emotional energy up for a given project is actually huge. Like that, it's a huge form of like what can move this project forward. It's like, well, how motivated is Matt to do it?
Right.
You know, and I'm usually pretty motivated for a lot of stuff. I just sort of tend to start gathering new projects like a decorator crab or something. But yeah, anyway, there's the emotional side of that, which is a whole other thing. So
yeah, no, I think that's a recurring theme that we hear in open source, that, you know, that one comment that's like, you know, you're sharing something you built and people are like, well, but it doesn't do this, and like that can drag you down. But when you celebrate those victories, or you have that empathy that, oh yeah, this person has other things in their life or other projects, that really lifts you up and gives you the energy to keep going, because it energizes us to get that positive feedback. And I hope that this open source Discord community can serve as a way to amplify those positive feedback loops. I really like this point about, you know, Matt, you were talking about just chatting with Andre, and I think that's something that I've seen a lot, especially this year with, you know, people being locked down more in their own towns, but it makes people who are in a, you know, different state or country, different part of the world, seem so much closer. And I think I know I've had a lot of great connections with people in the community just on a whim. You connect, you're chatting, you seem to have something to discuss that you're like, oh, we both, like, we're really connecting on this thing. It would be nice to like do a video call sometime and chat. So just, you know, I mean, you want to be respectful of whether that might be a burden to ask somebody that. But if you really feel that you're getting into a discussion, you know, in a polite way, you can ask somebody if they have time for a chat, if they'd be interested sometime.
Yeah, let me,
please.
one other thought that reminded me of is like thinking about types of contributions. I guess you wouldn't really get Hacktober credit officially for this, but a really good contribution, especially to like for the benefit of Elm people who write Elm packages, is to like write a blog post about how to use that package to
Nice.
solve some real problem. Because like that, especially like I have that a lot for a lot of my libraries. It's like, oh, it's really cool. It works for me. I'd love more people to know about it. But like writing blog posts is a totally different skill. It takes like a lot of different types of energy. I'm not that
Can't
good
just
at
hand
it.
that
It
over to the
takes a long
marketing
time.
team. Like,
Yeah, right. Right.
Yeah.
And especially people who aren't people coming from the perspective of using the library rather than writing it often have a better and more relatable perspective anyway. So that's something to think about too, is like if you don't know how to contribute to a library, write a blog post about it. It's going to like make them feel great, open a conversation. Maybe they'll also see some of the pain points in it. And it also helps like that library get more useful to other people who hear about it more, see how to use it in a real world scenario, see code examples like in context.
Right. And it doesn't require any involvement from the maintainer if they don't, have the time for it. I think that, Elm Optimize Level 2, which Matt worked on, is another great example of that I love to see. Just this distribution of the work in the community in a way that's not dependent on the person who built the project. Elm Optimize Level 2 is not like, hey, can you merge this into the Elm compiler? It's like, hey, here's this thing. Just, it's a separate project.
So to give people a little bit of feedback in case they are not aware. So Elm itself, obviously, or not obviously, there are certain words when you speak about tech, I try to like remove completely. Obviously is one of them. Like it's never needed. So Elm has an optimized flag, right, which makes the generated code really nice to compress and run a bit faster and stuff. And I was really interested in actually exploring making things going even faster, right? Because I was on an optimization kick, which whenever the madness grabs you, like sometimes I just have to, I'm like, everything needs to be like super like fast. And then, and then like, okay, I got it out of my system. But so Elm Optimize Level 2, the thing that I was interested in doing was, I was like, okay, well, people like Robin and I know a number of other people had looked into what could Elm do to actually generate better JavaScript. And so the decision there was like, okay, well, you might think like, well, I'll make a PR to the compiler to like make it generate better JavaScript. And partially one of the reasons why I avoided that actually was because I was not familiar with the compiler's code base, and only, I haven't done Haskell in a decent amount of time. And I'm like, but the appetite I have for this project is actually kind of minimal. And I had a really awesome collaborator that we basically did this together. This was a joint project, wasn't me. But I was like, but there are all these projects that actually just like transform JavaScript. Let's just make something that we just ignore the compiler completely, and we can just have this tool. You'll run it after the Elm compiler, and it'll just do that. So that allowed me to do it in a way where like I don't have to like stress Evan out. This big, and actually it's pretty cool because it means for that project, if someone comes up with a cool idea of like, oh man, what if I want this optimization in the Elm thing? I'm like, great. Like you can write a little JavaScript transformation and you can like just run it and you can have that. Right. And that's it. That's the entire story. Like we don't need to, that's it. Like,
yeah, I love all these insights about how to make open source more sustainable and how to sort of distribute the load in an even way where, maintainers don't have to pay down all the burden, because ultimately that's one of the things I find really inspiring and beautiful about open source is that it's not just, you can have something that's creating something greater than you could imagine by yourself, because there's this bigger thing that's a part of. So I want to change gears a little bit and hear from you all about sort of the brainstorming process, because I think that's another interesting piece of open source. So I'm curious, like, what how do you come up with your ideas for what you're working on? And because I think that there's, you really do have to nurture these ideas. Matt was talking about just this getting on a kick of performance optimizations and then going through all these iterations of what it could look like. It could look like a contribution to the Elm compiler. It could look like a separate project, Matt's style animation library and then the Elm animator library. And there are all these iterations and evolutions. And so what works well for you all regarding just allowing these creative ideas to evolve? What are techniques that help you manage that and get those creative juices flowing and iterating?
Long walks.
Yeah, I love that.
Yep, I love my paper notebook as well. I always have a paper notebook basically anywhere I go. I'm very nervous if it's not within a few meters. So that is a constant companion. I have now like dozens and dozens of old ones sitting around.
I just ordered sorry to diverge a little bit. I just ordered a remark recently. It's not here yet, but I generate so many notes. It's ridiculous. So I'm hoping that this is like a good note-taking solution. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Remarkable. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think another really big one for me is like having multiple projects to cycle around between, because I think it's almost, if you spend too much time on like one repo or like especially one like specific problem, it's easy to sort of like spiral and get like focused on like, I have to solve this one specific thing.
Yeah.
And if you're able to step back, whether that's taking a walk or sleeping on it, but also just like working on something else for a little while, often you think, oh, actually, no, there are different ways I can think of it. And there are different approaches, and I don't actually have to do it that way. Or, so I really, I like being able to sort of, okay, I'm going to, leave Elm 3D Scene aside for now. I'm going to work on Elm units for a little while, or something non-Elm.
Leverage those sleep cycles a little.
Yeah, and just get your brain working different ways.
Yeah.
Are you going to jump in, Harry?
I'll just taking a month off a project is often the best thing you can do.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So I have a background in like user experience research. So a big thing I constantly do, and have kind of developed this skill over time, is like get myself in the mindset of a user, of like, okay, they're sitting down, they just heard about this library, they're coming to the docs for the first time, what's going through their head? And I guess I think about that both for like the publishing a package, but also for designing the API, and like think about, okay, what is the real world code going to look like that is going to need to use this? Which I guess related to that, in, for example, the case of Elm program test, it started as just some functions in an actual test file in the code I was working on at No Red Ink. And then later I was like, okay, I'm copying this to another test file. Maybe I should extract a module. But like having a simple version of something that people can start using and then see how it works. Matthew's kind of the expert at that, I think, in the Elm community, for like the style elephants and like, kind of incrementally.
I'm gonna have to explain that comment.
Oh yeah, so that was like the earlier release. Because what you knew that first release of Elm UI like wasn't going to be the final version, but you wanted to get it in front of people to get feedback.
Yeah, it's like the critical thing in getting something out there, and then it's like Ian was mentioning, right? It's like by having a project that has any sort of traction or whatever, or even just being out there. Honestly, it doesn't need to have like a following or whatever. You can start to have conversations with people, and you find people willing to sort of like, go with you. So Elm UI was originally style elements, right? And that was sort of really that sort of started as like kind of what Aaron was saying, like gathering things. Like I was doing a lot of, I was like, okay, I want to style things. Styling, I'm not having fun. like styling things. I've been doing this for a while, but I'm not having fun. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, go figure out how are people figuring out how to have fun with CSS, right? And that's not entirely true, because I don't mean like sketching out the Mona Lisa with pure CSS or something like that, even though that's pretty cool. But like, how are people making it so that it's a little bit more approachable? And then that turned into a package, which then led to, again, some deeper discussions with people who actually knew more about who definitely knew more about CSS than I did at the time, even though I'd been using it for a while, just realizing CSS is a huge, it's big. And then being able to iterate. And then, so there was another project called Stylish Elephants, because I remember coming up with that on the subway and I thought it was really hilarious. And then, but also confusing, like, is now what I know about it.
But I like that it made it clear, like, this is going to change.
It's like,
but
yeah,
if you
it's
want
like,
to
don't
experiment with this bleeding edge thing. I mean, I think
if you're coming here, it's insanity, right?
Yeah,
like, yeah.
I think having a silly name actually serves that purpose pretty.
It probably made sense, yeah. But yeah. And then it did mean when I'm like, oh, now it's Elm UI, people, whoa,
yeah,
got a name,
yeah. Which, like, I feel like I had a similar thing in Elm format of, like, I wanted to have a place to experiment, so I started, like, I had these experimental releases. Where I was like, okay, we're trying out some format changes. They might not actually be what we end up with in the next stable version, but that was particularly useful, especially in Elm, where the community is relatively small, but like, to get people to actually use something for real is very important compared to just like people looking at it and thinking about using it for real and like giving feedback based on what they think. It's like much better to get actual feedback based on people actually trying to use it. So I always try to set things up to like get something working quickly, even if I know it's not complete. And often it surprises me how usable something is much faster, even though it's not like Elm format. There's still a bunch of missing things about, like, it doesn't handle comments in certain parts of type annotations. But nobody knows because nobody ever uses comments there, and it doesn't really matter. But it's still not like, that's why it's not 1.0 yet, because there's still like some actual serious bugs. It's just in practice nobody ever hits them.
So how do you manage those experimental releases? Like, what are, like, we talked about the stylish elephants approach, to coin a term. Of sort of having like a separate package that's for a sort of reimagining of a project. How did you handle that in the specific case of the experimental Elm format features, Aaron?
Well, I basically just like made to mention it in the release notes. I had a special tag. It, like, in it, Elm format's released with NPM, so you can tag a version as like not being a stable release, so people don't get it automatically. In the case of Elm packages, it's kind of interesting, and it seems like Evan is trying to encourage this approach as well. It's like he wants people to make new packages to experiment with different things. And like, actually, I've been helping a company upgrade from Elm 18 to Elm 19. And I've kind of been seeing this more directly of how third-party packages that people made in Elm 18 about dealing with dates and times and time zones really influenced the design of the new Elm time library, like to great benefit.
Right.
So I think that's like, and I've seen that, I guess, work for my own Elm packages as well, where I'll like kind of do something experimental. Someone else will maybe see that, try something different. Then eventually someone comes along who really has more time to invest in a serious project and like really solves that problem. So that's another way to contribute too, is like, if you see a problem, you don't have to contribute to the project that it's like already exists. You can also start your own experimental thing, see how it works. Maybe they could get merged. Maybe it'll influence a future version, things like that.
Yes, right. That's a great point. I've actually had somebody who I've spoken to a lot, Philip, has given me some great feedback on my Markdown library, but he also built a package on the side that we can sort of harvest for ideas that might be a good fit to come back into the mainline library. So that's a really cool approach too.
I've also, I was thinking about it as Aaron was talking. So like with Elm UI, there that I've been interested in, which is to use the CSSOM, right? So there's the DOM, which we're all used to, right? But there's also a similar object model for CSS. And there are some benefits, like Elm UI needs to insert some styles. And right now, because Elm is pure, we're sort of gathering all those things into a big string and then inserting those where we can. But that can be more performance adverse, obviously, because you're doing a bunch of stuff. So I remember there's actually like a secret feature in Elm UI where you can really only get to it if, I guess I'm pretty sure you need to actually like GitHub or git install. So basically like have this project cloned into your project, right? So you were going around Elm package, or basically just having like clone this into a folder, link to it in your Elm JSON, and then this magical option will be exposed that you can use, where you can tell Elm UI like, hey, don't worry, I'm including some JavaScript here or whatever. Go for it, right? And so I'm not sure if that's an avenue to encourage. It's definitely been one where I'm like, because like I experimented with it and I'm like, okay, so this seems probably useful for some people, but it does require including some JavaScript, which is kind of I don't really want to do. But there could be an avenue there for including experimental features like that, without having to basically have a whole separate repo, depending on like if it's more like incremental or tinier. Anyway.
Right. Okay. I want to do, before we wrap up, I want to hear like a quick lightning round of ideas that you all have about specific API design techniques as they relate to packages. Because there are some particular techniques that apply specifically to Elm packages. Anybody have any techniques they're particularly fond of?
I guess this may not be as specific as you're looking for, Dylan.
Yes.
One really useful technique that I found is you get your package to the point where you're like, okay, it's ready to release. All the docs are in place. I'm happy with the API. At that point, just leave it for a week.
Nice.
And it's so tempting to release it. But, I mean, almost like, very often, like 3 days later, like, oh, you know what? Actually, I don't like that. I know a better way to do that, and then you go fix it.
It's like cooking a steak, right? You got to let it rest.
Right.
Yep.
And maybe,
but yeah, if you can go a week, and you haven't had that experience of, you know what, I should change something, then it's probably ready to go.
Right. And you can even ship your docs using Elm Doc Preview. You can you can publish your docs for a work in progress branch or a particular release that hasn't been released as a package yet. And so let that sit out there for a week, put it in front of people, and that gets ideas going in your head where you're like, is this really what I want to present to people? That's a great tip. I love it.
It's funny because it's like you've just run a marathon and you're that's how I feel.
Yeah.
I'm like near the finishing line and I'm just like pacing, like waiting.
That's hilarious.
It's a really good point.
Other
Nice.
API design techniques for packages.
Well, mine's pretty high level too, but I would say like don't like forget what you think you know already. Like if you're solving an API problem, like you're coming from some probably existing way to do things that you've seen before, or that isn't working quite right and you want to add to it. And that can like often end up with messy stuff. So like I constantly try to revisit and say like, okay, knowing what I know now, if I were starting from complete scratch, what is the simplest API I would be making here? And I guess related to that is also trying to look for ways that you can trim down an API. Like as things get added, the API needs to get refactored and simplified down and condensed, just like code does as it grows.
Yeah.
Well, one technique that I realize I love, Elm really facilitates, and I realize emphasizing it more. When you're starting out a project, or actually anytime, doing type sketches for stuff is really useful to get your brain around if something's going to work. So what is a type sketch? It's like just start sketching some types. You're going to write no implementation. You're going to write type signatures of functions, and you're going to write types. And then you're going to like gut check, could I write this function?
You can use debug to do there too. That's helpful
totally
for the implementations.
And then you can get to a point where you can really quickly just sort of get a feel for what the API would be like. Nothing works, of course, but it's like you're going to be able to check like, oh, but you're going to run into like you're going to find your design problems, whether it be like, oh, I need to have this value over here, or I need to like, whatever. Just super useful. We try to do that more at Blissfully, more involved like features that we're shipping. Just like, okay. And so two of us will sit down and be like, okay, or maybe one comes with a type sketch. Like, this is what I think the situation is. I'm going to walk you through it. It's a really fast way to communicate between people what's happening.
Yeah. Any other API design techniques?
Nope, you're on your own.
If we're good on that.
Go ahead. The other technique is log into the incremental Elm Discord and ask for people's opinions on things.
I know, that's been pretty wonderful. Yeah. Well, great. So let's close off the roundtable discussion with let's just sort of go around the roundtable again and maybe hear like a closing thought and like maybe like something you wish you could teach your earlier self about open source. So if anybody's got a light bulb, feel free to start. I see some gears turning for some people.
What could I teach myself earlier? I think the thing for that is like starting to reflect more on what my relationship to open source is. Like, it can be a hobby, but it's also related to your career development, to your actual job, and other companies are like getting value from that work. So I think for me personally, like I would have liked to start reflecting on those sort of questions sooner. But to your other question, the thought I want to leave people with too is that you don't need to be reliant on existing package maintainers to contribute to the Elm ecosystem. And like this Discord in particular is great as a place to just start conversations with other people, because maybe there's a bunch of people, you're one of them, other people in the chat who have something they want to solve in Elm. Nobody's worked on it yet. Like just starting those conversations, and maybe you don't want to particularly start a new library or know what is needed for that, but having those conversations can lead to something really great. And like Noah Hall used to organize, and other people too, the Elm community Slack channel and the related GitHub organization. So yeah, don't be afraid to just start conversations with other people and come together and try creating something new and see where it leads as well.
Right. Love that.
I think one sort of one thing for me is sort of the importance of patience, I guess. And I think especially if you just sort of had a cool idea for a package, you publish it, and often that happens, and then nothing happens, right? And that's totally fine. That's expected, because it's unlikely that if you just publish something today, that someone has the exact problem tomorrow, and then they immediately start using it. Like that's not how it works. And so I think it's very common for you to you publish something, and then maybe like months later, now people will start using it because they've had time to hear about it, think about it, a problem has come up where they can use it. So I think sometimes it's easy to think that, I put this out there with a big splash and nothing happened. Have a bit of patience.
Yeah.
And then especially if you're sort of new to the Elm community, there's also a certain amount of, great, somebody published a thing, are they going to be around for a while? Do they have, are they good at what they do? Can I trust this package? And it does take some time before you sort of get to the point where people say, oh, okay, yes, I've seen this person, they've been active for a while. I think I have, confidence that if I use it, it's going to be a good experience. So yeah, both of those ways. Sometimes you just need to stay active in the community for a while, before people really start picking up on your publishing. But even if you've got to the point where you've been in the community for a while, you still, you publish something and people are not going to use it right away, or maybe a couple of people will for something for fun.
Right.
Certainly, Elm 3D Scene published that a few months ago, and a few people did some little stuff right away because they wanted to try it. But it's only sort of now, a few months later, that I've actually had people sort of come back. Hey, I'm building this cool tool at work with this, and it makes total sense. It just takes a while for that to start happening.
Yeah.
Don't be discouraged.
Great stuff. Yeah. And you don't necessarily know which projects people are going to get excited about either. So it's okay to just, start another one and see if that picks up momentum and resonates.
And I think there's also there's this question of why you do stuff, right? Because it's totally cool to have a project where it's you publish it and you really had a fun time putting it together. And maybe your goal doesn't have to be that it gets traction, right?
Yes.
Open source is sort of it's like show and tell, it's you put your stuff out there and you can actually choose how much engagement you want with the community, right? Sometimes it's I think we have this concept again of open source where it's that you accept contributions, you're managing contributions, blah, 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 or not, or you have a community, whatever. Right. It's I'm not sure that we all need that definition necessarily. Open source is literally your code is available and probably under some license that someone can use it and they can change it on their machine. Yes. Right. The other stuff came later.
Right.
So, and that's okay. So when I my personal motivations I've had to think about this a lot with Elm UI because it's been or in some form around for a while now, and especially with the other kind of projects, and all the projects are big enough where it's I have to, basically I'll take a month or two and sort of focus on one because it's I can't turn all the plates. They're just too big. And so it's easy to kind of get burnt out. So I think a lot about why am I interested in a project, right? And partially it's so it's not necessarily so people can use it, even though I'm really happy that people are able to use it and I want to make it more usable. It's so I can have some discussion, so I can go to conferences and speak to people about I'm interested in design and animation. I basically just want more conversations about that stuff.
Yeah.
And from those conversations, I've built something, right? And partially, I have this thing of, I almost view it as oh my God, what am I doing, right? But where it's there are things I want to build, but I end up just building the tools to build the things instead of building the thing, yep. which is actually okay. I had to actually sort of give myself permission, that's fine. That's actually it's a thing itself, and that's actually wonderful. And you can still come back and do those other things you want to get done later. I think the thing that's been comforting to me has been actually being okay with things being longer term. It's I'm pretty comfortable that Elm UI is going to be around. I'm still going to be interested in some form 5 years from now. So that's okay. Like that's great. It means I have some time to do this in a way where I'm actually going to be happy about it. And again, that's why I'm also grateful for people being patient with me, because I realize moving into that other headspace where I feel like stressed out, it's ultimately detrimental, right? So I'm not to say people have to say like, get it in for the long haul. Like it's more just be aware of kind of what you're getting out of it, right? It's like getting stuff out there is good professionally. Great. That's cool. Like that's a benefit. That's a good motivation, right? Getting something out there because you want it, like you want to express an idea. That's cool too.
Right.
Like
that guides your decisions along the process and how you do it.
Yeah, or maybe gives you. And to be fair, these questions you may have an answer immediately. You may also think about it a lot. Just because I'm talking about this stuff, it's like I have a better idea probably than I started, but it's still something. Like I'll definitely get to a point where I'm like, what am I doing with this thing? Like, why am I doing this? And I have to sort of take a breath, take a break. Like, here's a framework that I like to think about, which I there's some sort of relationship with privilege here, but like, if I had no constraints on my time, like let's say I was taking, I have all the money I need, I have all the, whatever, what would I be doing? It's like, I would probably be making like cool, weird Elm packages. Yeah. I'm like, okay, great. And I'd probably like not stress out about how long it's taking, because that's like the thing I wanted. Right. It's like, okay, well, can I just do that right now in my free time? It's like, well, yeah, I can. It's like, okay, so is there a problem? It's like, no, there's not a problem.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Great stuff. Harry, do you want to share a closing thought and something you wish you could teach your past self?
Yeah. I guess my hot take is it's easier to contribute than you think. It's just there's better ways of doing it. Just make you a pull request on a random Git repository. That's quite a hard way to contribute. You need a lot of patience. But yeah, finding a community and asking, how can I help? I've got these skills. You will find a way to contribute, and there's a lot of people who will appreciate that greatly.
Well,
but yeah, find a repository that's actively looking for contributions, and they'll really appreciate your time.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Well, with that, let's all thank our speakers. If you want to give an emoji round of applause in the Hacktoberfest channel, you could show your appreciation in there. Thank you all so much. This has been a lovely discussion. I really appreciate it. And so now we're going to go to the Q&A section. So anybody who wants to continue discussing with people, feel free to jump into Chit Chat Room. Just, introduce yourself to somebody, tell them what you're curious about, what you want to explore, maybe what your goals are. Or feel free to jump into the Elm Review Q&A room, where Jeroen will be helping people get started with Elm Review. And the Elm Markdown Q&A room, where I'll be helping people get started contributing to Elm Markdown. And again, thank you all so much. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Dylan.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dylan.
Yeah, man, this is great.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks, guys. I'll see you online.